Praise the Lord, church. This is Apostle Samuel Masharia. Today I'm studying in for Reverend Washeke. I want to take you through Ephesians chapter 5. Most welcome and God bless you. As we learned during the introduction to Paul's letter to the Ephesians, the letter is different compared to many of the other New Testament letters that Apostle Paul wrote. Like Romans, Ephesians was not written so much to address problems in a particular church. More so, it was written to explain some of the great themes and doctrines of Christianity. Chapter 5 is no different. And just to remind you, Paul wrote this letter from prison. Chapter 5 may be divided into 5 sub-themes, and one will be exhortation to brotherly love, verses 1 and 2. And then between verses 13 and 14, we'll see cautions against several sins. And then verses 15 to 21, we see directions to a contrary behavior and to relative duties. And verse 22 and 33, we see the duties of wives and husbands as enforced by the spiritual relationship between Christ and the church. So exhortation to brotherly love is the beginning. And here, Bible says, therefore be imitators of God as dear children, and walk in love as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. Here, Paul concludes the thoughts from Ephesians chapter 4, where he described how Christians should relate to one another. Remember that the last verse of Ephesians chapter 4, which is verse 32, he said, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. And therefore now he comes, and he encourages us to be imitators of God as dear children. And here, Paul is setting before his Christian people the highest standard in all the world. He tells them they must be imitators of God. And later, someone called Clement of Alexandria, he was to say daringly that the true Christian wise man practices being God. When Paul talked of imitation, he was using language which the wise men of Greece could understand. What are you imitating? Is it not forgiveness, love, kindness, generosity, righteousness, holiness, among other virtues that are associated with God? By being imitators of God, we are to make God our example and model. We can't content ourselves comparing us among men. We must heed the idea of 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 15 to 16. As he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, be holy, for I am holy. Now, Ephesians 5, 3 to 4, so it talks about several sins. Paul is cautioning against those sins. He says, but fornication and no uncleanness or covetousness, let it not even be named among you, as is fitting for saints, neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. Filthy lusts must be rooted out, brethren. These sins must be dreaded and detested. Here are not only cautions against gross acts of sin, but against what some may make light of. But these things are so far from being profitable, they pollute and poison the hearers. A good man will be ashamed to speak of what many wicked men are not ashamed to do. We must have not only a sight and a knowledge that sin is sin, and is a measure shameful, but see it as a breach of God's holy law. After the example of prophets and apostles, we should call on those asleep and dead in sin to awake and arise, that Christ may give them light. When he says, let not even be named among you, Paul groups together these ideas of sexual sin and impropriety, indicating that none of these are fitting for saints and should not even be named among God's people. And then Paul also talked about marriage, the spirit-filled life, submission, and responsibility in marriage. If you do studies, you'll find that much earlier, Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, the chapter 7, verse 1 to 40, he talked about marriage, but in a totally different perspective. He was talking about marriage and about relationship between men and women. And Paul was teaching then that marriage was permissible. And what he was emphasizing here is that people were to get married so as to avoid temptation to immorality. That's why he said each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. But between 1 Corinthians and Ephesians, there is a space of perhaps 9 years. And in these 9 years, Paul may have realized that the second coming was not to be so soon as he had thought. That in fact, he and his people are living, not in a temporary situation, but in a more or less permanent situation. And it is in Ephesians that we find Paul's true teaching on marriage, that Christian marriage is the most precious relationship in life, whose honor parallel is a relationship between Christ and the church. And he says to wives, Paul addressed wives and their responsibility in the Christian marriage. He began with them. This is not because they are a bigger problem or because they need special attention. The reason is that Apostle was particularly concerned about this question of submission. To submit means that you recognize someone has a legitimate authority over you. It means that you recognize that there is an order of authority and that you are part of a unit, a team. You as an individual are not more important than the working of the unit or the team. When we submit to God, we recognize God's authority and act accordingly. When we submit, for example, to the police, we recognize the authority of the police and act accordingly. When we submit to our employer, we recognize the authority of our employer and act accordingly. Brethren, submission does not mean inferiority. As well, submission does not mean silence. Submission means submission. There is a mission for the Christian marriage, and that mission is obeying and glorifying God. The wife says, I'm not going to put myself under that mission. That mission is more important than my individual desires. I am not putting myself below my husband. I am putting myself below the mission God has for our marriage, for my life. And then he says, submit to your husbands. When he says to your husband, this defines the sphere of the wife's submission. The Bible never commands a general submission, that women should submit to all men in society. It is to your husband. This order is commanded only in the spheres of the home and in the church. God has not commanded in his word that man has exclusive authority in the areas of politics, business, education, and so on. And then he says, husbands, love your wives. Paul's words to Christian husbands safeguards his previous words to wives. The wives are to submit to their husbands. It never excuses husbands acting as tyrants over their wives. Loving your wives, Paul used this ancient Greek word agape. The ancient Greeks had 4 different words to translate love. If Paul's message in this great passage could be boiled down to 2 principles, which must govern our thinking and our actions as married people, these 2 are: husbands, to you, understand that you and your wife are one. You are a unity. 2, wives, understand that your unity has a head, and that is your husband. Therefore, the duty of wives is submission to their husband in the Lord, which includes honoring and obeying them from a principle of love to them. The duty of husbands is to love their wives. The love of Christ to the church is an example, which is sincere, pure, and constant, notwithstanding her failures. God bless you so much. I want to believe that this teaching is going to continue blessing you. Ephesians 5 is such a blessing. God bless you. God bless you. God bless you. Shalom, shalom.